Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Lian Li Galahad 2 LCD with SL Infinity fans on a 360mm radiator inside the Lian Li Evo XL. And I want to talk to you about the setup and wiring of this all-in-one cooler and show you the process for it in this case, but also with push-pull setup. So I'm going to show you how to do it with 6 fans if you so wish, as well as the standard wiring logic and other things to consider along the way. Now this is a powerful new CPU cooler with a Acertec 8 Gen pump on it and some pretty nifty highlights, as you've seen already. Very nice looking with a customizable display and more. Now inside the box you get a number of different things, and I'm going to show you the wiring process for, as I said, push-pull, the standard setup, and this is on an Intel LGA 1700 motherboard. So stick with me, find out more about this. Naturally, this is an all-in-one cooler where the coolant is already inside the system, so you don't need to worry about filling it up. And you'll see that the fans come pre-installed. So the SL-120 Infinity fans are already on the radiator, ready to go for you. And so they're wired up in an exhaust setup and screwed in, and then you've just got 2 cables to connect at the end. And that's an interesting highlight because you'll notice that that's not the triple pack cable. More on that in a minute. The pump itself also has pre-applied thermal paste along with the bracketing for Intel motherboards. And obviously you also have the ability to use this with AMD should you need to. And there's also some stickers covering both the fans and the pump head. Obviously we'll keep that on for the moment to avoid getting fingerprints on it. And you also want to think about the same for the fans as well, and don't remove the plastic covering off the thermal paste. You'll notice there are a couple of connectors on here, as well as one single cable coming out of the pump head. I'm going to show you the wiring for all of this, but note that the larger connector you see there next to the USB-C cable actually isn't used in the Infinity version of this cooler. And that's important because I made a mistake there and I panicked about it. So I want you to be calm as I show you all the different connections as we go through this. First of all, that single cable that comes out of the pump head, that goes to your all-in-one pump header on your motherboard. Now this is in various different places, but on this one it's in the top right. In a minute I'm going to show you another one where it's actually underneath the CPU. But that is the connection there. So all-in-one pump header is the one you want for the cooler itself. And then the fans will connect somewhere else in a second. So that's a fairly straightforward connection. And then you also have a USB connection, this USB-C, and that connects to the bottom of the motherboard. And this is important because this will allow you to control the RGB lighting and obviously the display via Lian Li's L-Connect software. So you need to make sure that's clicked in. And there is a little click in that as well, so push it all the way into the pump head because otherwise the connection might be a bit loose and that might cause issues. And then that plugs into the bottom of the motherboard. Now obviously I'm showing you this all outside the case and the build, so it's easy to see, but naturally you'd actually do this once the motherboard's installed, and I'll show you that again in a little while, but I want everything to be clear as we go through this. Now included in the box is also a fan controller, which is an Infinity fan controller, but with a difference because it's an all-in-one cooler one. So this is specifically for that. A very similar version came with the previous Infinity Galahad 2 cooler, which you can see here. Here I want to show you that's basically the same setup. It has a number of connections on it, including SATA power, which you'll need for your power supply unit. But you will notice if we put it side by side with the standard Infinity controller that you get with a triple pack, you'll notice that it's quite a bit different, the controller that comes with this cooler, and that may complicate things. You'll see, for example, that the standard triple pack one on the left-hand side has those single flat connectors that you'd expect to come out of your fans and connect up to that, whereas the all-in-one is set up really for the single fans. So if you buy single fans, you have those 2 cables, as you've seen on the radiator, that then connect up to that. So on the left hand side is a triple pack of Infinity SL-120 fans, and you see that flat connector, so that gives you a single cable that plugs into the standard controller. And then obviously the one that comes with it all-in-one is a bit more complicated, so I want to cover that and what you can do with it and how to probably solve your problems if you're having any concerns. So as standard, obviously the fans are already connected. You have the cables here. We have 2 cables, one for fan power and one for RGB. The RGB one plugs into the one with the clip. The fan power plugs in below that. There's 4 ports on here, which obviously means you could potentially power multiple groups of fans. So you could have 3 other groups in this controller with the same logic with those 2 cables. So if you bought multiple single packs, this is actually not a problem. You could just connect them up in their daisy chain group and then connect them to the spare ports that are on that controller. Included in the box is also another cable. And once again, this logic is fairly similar. If you're already aware of sort of the wiring logic of these controllers, then it should be fairly easy. But basically, you have a USB cable that connects to the bottom of it, and this other additional cable here, which is split into two parts, one for RGB and one for fan power. Now, usually with an Infinity controller, you'd plug that cable in there, and then you plug the fan power one into a sys fan header. Now, in this case, you're actually going to use a CPU fan, and that's because the cables that we're wiring up are connected up to the CPU fan header on the motherboard, which means if you want to, you can then control the fan speed via your motherboard software. The 3-pin cable that you see here connects up to the 5-volt RGB header, and again, this allows for RGB syncing from your motherboard software. So you have the option of using either L-Connect with the USB connection or the 5-volt RGB header and your CPU fan connections to control the fan speed and RGB lighting for your motherboard software. So the USB connection plugs in at the bottom as well, and this is essential if you want to control the fans that are connected to the cooler via L-Connect, and it's the same logic across other coolers from Lian Li as well. Now, obviously, this means we now have two USB connections, one from the controller and one from the pump as well. So you need to make sure you've got enough free ports on your motherboard. You see another example of a different motherboard here, but most modern motherboards will have two spare USB ports on the bottom middle that you can connect up to. Now, if like me, you've connected other things, you'll see obviously I had streamers in there, for example, and if you've got other RGB accessories or even other things, you might need more USB ports. If that's the case, I'd recommend something like NZXT's USB Hub. This allows you to connect 4 different USB connections into a single controller, which is then powered by SATA power and connects to a single port on your motherboard. This makes life a lot easier because it frees up one other connection, and it also gives you control over multiple different devices with ease, and it's pretty affordable. You can also get alternatives from Lian Li and Corsair if you're interested, so I'll link to those in the description. But that's that wiring. So the pump itself connects to the motherboard, the fans connect to the controller, and that's the standard setup for it and how you'd go about doing it. Now, if you want to do push-pull, which is actually what I'm doing in this case, but isn't essential, I'm going to show you the logic for that and what I did. So with the push-pull setup, we need 3 fans, obviously, and we also need that single cable that comes with the single packs of SL-120 Infinity fans. And this then has the same wiring logic that we've just done. So that clips into the side of the fans, obviously in their group, and then plugs into the controller. Take note of how the cable's clipped in, because you can actually adjust this, and I'll show you that in a little while if you need to neaten up your case. So with this, we're plugging in the fan power to the same controller and find a spare port on it. And what I'm doing is actually keeping the fans that are on the radiator and the same controller. So it's all controlled by the same controller, because I actually end up with 2 controllers in my system, but one for case fans and one for the fans in the cooler. Now, the other thing you'll find in the box with the cooler is this additional RGB cable. So that looks like a 5-volt pins that you get on your motherboard, but instead it replaces that on the standard fan connection and allows you to then connect up to the port on the controller, which then means that you can control the RGB lighting via L-Connect. There's multiples of these cables included in the box as well, so it does mean that this controller is really easy to use with loads of different case fans if you want to. So you could easily plug in 2 more groups of fans into this controller with the same logic and put them elsewhere in your case. You then need to go into the L-Connect software and just assess which ones you need to work out the fan curve for the cooling that's on the radiator. Because what we're going to do is we're going to put 6 fans on this rad. Now, this isn't necessary, but I want to show you the steps for doing it and how to do it if you want to, because I think some people will probably want to do this. So you need to make sure you're mounting the fans in the same direction. You can see face down into the case and then face down onto the back of the radiator, so they're both flowing air in the same direction and are going to be exhausting in this instance out of the case. You could alternatively use Lian Li's reverse fans or flip the fans over if you wanted to do intake instead. That's something I might revisit in the future. Make sure you peel off all the stickers at this point, although obviously they're going to protect it. It would probably be easier than trying to do it once it's in the case. Now I'm working out the logic of how I'm going to put this radiator in the case. Now you may want to top mount instead. I've actually done a guide separately on the best place to mount your all-in-one cooler. I personally prefer the setup like this, and I like the way it looks, and I also am planning on doing push-pull in this orientation, so this is the way I'm doing it, but I'll link to that other video in the description. Now what you can see is we're working out the positioning of it and where the pump's going to be and where the tubes will sit. The nice thing about this cooler is the tubes are adjustable on the radiator, so you can actually reposition them and turn them round. The guidance is to try and get the tubes on the pump head itself, though, at the bottom when you're installing it on the motherboard, as you'll see in a minute. So we're basically working out how much space we've got, where we're going to position it, and the logic for it. Again, you could top mount the radiator. Don't put it on the bottom of the case, but you could put it on the top if you prefer. But this is just one option I have, if you're interested, showing the different setups that you can do inside the Dynamic Evo XL. And I'll link to that in the description, because this case is highly flexible and there's lots of space in it. The positioning of this is now sort of logically worked out, but one thing people will say is, what about tubes down? You should do tubes down, because they don't understand how that works. But just for those people, you can see there's not much length. If you try and put tubes down in this position, you're not going to be able to do it probably unless you've got a very small graphics card or you mount the motherboard in the lowest point. Now for this build, I'm using a Strix motherboard, which is a Z790, and I'm going to show you the process for setting that up and preparing it before we put it into the case. Now this is my usual build, and this is a Intel Core i9-13900K. So I'm going to be revisiting this with a full review on the performance of this cooler in the near future if you're curious. So subscribe if you haven't already and you want to see a more in-depth look at the cooler's performance and features. But in this instance, we're just looking at the wiring. So this is a 1700 socket, LGA 1700 socket Intel motherboard, which means that you need to use the standoffs on that backplate and push them out to the far corners, so the furthest points that it will reach. Flip the motherboard over and then insert that through so that the standoffs sit through the other side. One thing of note is there's no stickers or stickiness to the back of this, so you sort of have to hold it in place. The installation's kind of weird, it's quite unusual. Most backplates usually have a sticker system to stick it to the back of the motherboard. That's not the case here, but you do have these little washers. Now, the rubber washers, and essentially they sit off the standoffs and then push towards the motherboard, and then they retain the standoffs in the right position when you've set it up like that. What I did find, though, and what I'd recommend is basically to pull the standoffs through as much as you can and try and force those rubber washers down onto the motherboard as tight as possible to stop any movement in the standoffs, because you don't really want those standoffs moving around. You want a nice solid connection in that setup. Once that's done, then obviously installing the motherboard into the case if you haven't got it in there already, and then we can go about preparing the rest of the setup. Now I'm going to start by just quickly showing you how you would install this as standard if you're not doing push-pull. So once again, I'm just checking the logic and making sure that everything will fit nicely and it's not going to be causing any problems. I'm not too happy with how the tubes are going to be blocking the RAM in this instance, but actually this case is really flexible, so I can just move the motherboard up, which I'll do in a minute, and that won't be a problem. So if you're installing the radiator in this way and you're not using push-pull, there are some small screws and washers that we need to use to install the radiator onto the case. In this case, the fan tray is removable at the rear, and that means you can then take that out and then just set it up ready to go with the radiator. So what we're doing now is basically just line that up with the holes on there and then screwing it in from behind. Obviously making sure to keep that same positioning that we just had when we were setting it up in the case and working out the logic for it. So there's a whole load of small screws and washers included in the all-in-one cooler box, and then you just need to line it up with the holes on the rad at the rear. So fairly straightforward. Now I'm obviously going to speed up the process here because there's a lot of these to go in, but we need to just make sure that's lined up. Now, I've already said, but this is exhausting air out of the case. So in this instance, I'm pulling air into the bottom of the case, and then cold air is being pulled from the fans on the front of the radiator, through the radiator and out of the back of the case. You may prefer to do it the other way around, to flip the fans over, for example, and then pull cold air in through the radiator instead. It's really going to vary. Again, I've done tests on this to show which way around is best. I personally prefer to intake cold air because I want to keep my CPU running cool, but I actually want to get to do some tests on this case in the near future and see which is best, because in the current setup I've only got 3 intake fans on the bottom. Once we've done that, we then put the radiator back in place, feeding it through from the back in this case. But obviously if you're using a different case, you just have that seated in there already, probably mounting it onto a fan tray and using those small screws to attach it. But there's plenty of room in the back of this case, which is why it's great for push-pull setup if you wanted to do it. And then we'll flip it back over, and now we're going to install the pump head. Obviously taking care this whole time not to knock the plastic cover off the pump head, because you really don't want to damage that thermal paste because it's pre-applied, although there is extra included in the box as well if you do need it, so that's beneficial. So now we'll take off that plastic cover, and then you just need to line up the pump head with the standoffs that are already installed on there that we've just sorted out a minute ago. So you just line that up. Now, there are a number of thumb screws included in the box, and you'll have to look at the manual to work out which one's the right for you. But in this instance, because it's LGA 1700, we're looking for the ones with the small dots on top that you'll see in a second. So carefully put the pump head down on top of that and make sure that they're all lined up on the standoffs. And then you find these thumb screws, which have 4 small dots around the outside of them. You'll notice there's a screwdriver head hole as well. So we can start off with just using our hands to tighten them, but then in a minute we'll tighten it up fully with a screwdriver. Now you do need to take care when installing something like this, both that it's not too loose and that it's not too tight, because if it's too tight you could damage the pins. If it's too loose, then there won't be enough contact between the copper plate and the CPU, and then the cooling won't be as good. So if you do this, set it up, then go into Windows and run some benchmarks and find your temps are a bit too hot, it could well be that you just haven't tightened these up. And it's so easy to do because I've done it myself a number of times in the past. So I usually just take a screwdriver to it at the end and just make sure it's tight, but don't obviously force it. You just got to make sure each of these is in. And I recommend doing corner to corner, so bottom left, top right, bottom right, top left, for example, in the screwing logic, and then that'll just install a lot easier in that setup. Now we're going to quickly take a look at what you do with push-pull. So that's the basic setup for the standard, obviously with the wiring, which we'll get to in a minute when I covered earlier. But if you wanted to do push-pull instead, then you could follow this. So I'm taking out the small screws that I installed with the radiator. Obviously you wouldn't even put those in if you're doing push-pull in the first place. So what we'd do instead is you put those fans on, and then we need some long radiator screws. Now there are no extra screws included in the box, so you will need to purchase these, and I'll leave a link in the description so you can find some. But basically these are long radiator screws that will pass through the fans, through the fan tray and into the radiator, and then these are holding the whole thing in place. So instead of those small screws that come with the rad, we're using long radiator screws. It's the same sort of screws that are included with the radiator on the front, so the fans are running in that way, same sort of logic, but now we're doing it on the back. And again, take care to make sure that your fans are installed in the same direction so that they're both facing the same way. They're not fighting each other for dominance in terms of the air pull and push. You need to make sure they're both set up logically. And so we're just finalizing this setup here, and you can see obviously these daisy chain or fans are really easy to set up because you can just clip them together, and that's one of the nice benefits of these Lian Li fans. And just Unifans are so easy to install, even if you're doing something like this. So you could upgrade to push-pull in the future if you're not doing push-pull to begin with, so that's something to consider. Now the fan cables from the front fans obviously need to be run to the rear because that's where we're going to put the controller. A little bit fiddly because there's a lot of cables to feed through and worry about. And also I noticed when I was doing this, and this is something to consider as well, that the cables at the bottom are now facing the wrong direction. The nice thing about this is the design of this means you can unclip the cable from there, and then there's a little cover which you just need to slide off. You can then flip the direction of the cable and then put that cover back on. This basically means that the cabling can then be run in a nicer direction and keep the front of your case looking a bit neater, which is another nice highlight of this. And then you just need to replace the connector on the bottom of the fans, and that's that done. So that's really easy, and you can do that with the case fans as well, so you can hide the cables away a bit more efficiently and make it look neater at the front and improve the airflow potentially. So now I need to wire up rear fans and the front fans. So just finding the cables from both of them. And I'm repeating what I showed you earlier on, which is making sure these are all connected up to the controller. Now, the controller comes with a 3M sticker, which is double-sided sticky back. So you peel off both sides of that and then stick it on. The idea here is that we can find somewhere in the case where you can install it and stick that down. Now, I'd recommend not sticking it down just yet. Don't make the same mistake that I'm about to, because I was thinking about where I was going to position it, knowing that I was going to have to install several other controllers in order to get this case working for my build. And I positioned it at the bottom because I thought that was a logical way to do it. The fan cables will all reach. And as I'll show you, that this actually causes a problem in a second. But basically what we've got to do is put the RGB cables in and the fan power cables, and obviously plug them in. And what I'd recommend is making a note of the ports you're using for the CPU fans. So the fans that are on the radiator, I put, for example, in port 1 and port 2. If you're then going to be using other ports for system fans, you can then adjust that in the L-Connect software and basically set up your cooling performance specifically for those. Don't forget that the controller will also need SATA power, so you need that flat power connector from your power supply unit, and that will ensure that that's powered nicely so it can power all the fans. And then you need the USB connection to the motherboard for the RGB control. Now, this is where I realized I'd made a mistake, because obviously I have this other cable to come from the controller to the CPU fan header, as I showed you earlier on. And being at the bottom of the case is not going to work because that CPU fan connection is actually higher up and the cable isn't long enough. So something to consider before you stick it down, and I think that's important to note. So running that through, as well as the 5V RGB header cable if you want to control it from your motherboard. So the CPU fan connection goes in there, and in the top right, and then the all-in-one pump header again. So this is slightly different on this motherboard. It actually goes bottom left below the CPU instead of top right where I showed earlier. So there may be some variance. Your motherboard might vary, but hopefully it'll be one of these positions. So once again, the pump connects to the all-in-one pump header. The fan cable from the controller, which controls the fans on the radiator, goes to the CPU fan header. And that's then all set up there. Now, what I was doing here is, as I mentioned earlier on, it's easy to adjust the motherboard position in this case because it actually has 3 different places where you can set the motherboard. This means if you're using this case, you can then reposition it and adjust the tubes and the position of that to make it look a little bit nicer. This is obviously not essential and it's a personal preference, but it does mean that I can move them up a bit. I can also adjust the positioning of the tubes and then make it look nicer and get a better view of the RAM. One other thing that I'm not showing here, but you will see in the end clips, is Lian Li's also included a couple of Velcro ties that you can wrap around the tubes to tighten them up and neaten them if you want to, so you can actually make it look a lot nicer in the sort of way they're running out of the radiator and just make that neat. That's pretty nice inclusion. It's a small thing that you might otherwise miss, so just watch out for the end clips of that. And then don't forget to connect up the CPU connection to the pump. This is really important if you want to be able to control the screen. Obviously the power for the pump, so as in it being powered to push the liquid around, is coming from your motherboard, but you need to make sure you've got this connection if you want to make the most of the display and the RGB lighting around the outside of it. Just connect that up, and then L-Connect 3 should recognize it once you boot into Windows. And we then need to run it around. So I was initially running it to the side, and then I realized it would probably be better. It's quite a nice long cable, so you can run it over the top, down the back, and then back through the bottom and plug it into that USB port that I showed you earlier on, which is right at the bottom of the motherboard. So it's a good long cable. It's quite thick, but I actually don't think it takes away from the overall design. It's not too hideous. It's fairly straightforward to set up and plug in. And then that's most of that all set up and done. So you can see we just power it on, and then the display's working, the RGB's lighting up nicely. Now, a quick note, as I said, those other fans, so the fans on the top and the bottom and the rear fan, are actually controlled by a separate controller in my case, but you could use the all-in-one pump controller as well if you're just adding 2 extra groups of fans. And that's the final product. Hopefully you found this useful. Check out the links in the description for more, and subscribe if you haven't already, and come back and see the review. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.